Simpson matter. Mr. Simpson is again present before the court with his counsel, Mr. Shapiro, Mr. Douglas, Mr. Bailey, Mr. Blazier, people represented by Ms. Clark, Mr. Darden, and Mr. Escobar. Ms. Clark.
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning. I'm asking leave of the court to be heard concerning the terminology of the use of the word match by our expert, Mr. Deedrick. And the reason I'm asking leave of the court to be heard on this is that we have citations for the court in which such language was used by the expert testifying. And we also have reference to the very guide Mr. Bailey was referring to yesterday, which indicates that the use of the term match is appropriate under these circumstances. We also have page 7. We also have citations coming in by fax from around the country in which other experts have used the terminology match in the arena.
Isn't this a little late?
Well, I never anticipated the court would preclude the use of the word until the ruling yesterday. And I did not have, obviously, during the time I was presenting testimony, I didn't have time to do the research. I did last night. But it had been my anticipation that the court was going to rule in favor of the defense motion in that regard. I would have done the research in advance. But I did not have any advance warning of that.
So what would you like me to do?
I'm going to cite to the court the cases, and I would like the court to permit the expert to use the terminology because it is very cumbersome for him to continually be thinking up terms that he would not use in place of the term he is accustomed to using and has been approved in all of the courts he's testified to, thus 400 times prior to this. The Hicks Guide, Microscopy of Hair, which was brought out by Mr. Bailey at sidebar yesterday, states the following. Hairs found on the rape victim's clothing which match the suspect's hair serve to corroborate her statements when the suspect denies any contact, indicating obviously the approval of the use of the terminology match. In People v. Bonin, 47 Cal 3rd 808, at page 823, it indicates that the prosecution presented expert testimony to the following effect. Among other things, the bodies of Gatlin, Grabs, and Maccabee each revealed the presence of foreign hair that matched defendants. People v. Thomas, 180 Cal App 3rd, page 47 at page 51. That expert testimony is being was proffered, and it indicates pubic hair identical to defendants was found in Priscilla's bed. Similarly, pubic hair matching that of Priscilla's was found in a combing of defendant's pubic hair at the time of his arrest.
All right, do you have any cases specifically on point, counsel, regarding terminology?
We have cases coming in by fax as we speak, Your Honor. But the use of the summary of the terminology given in the factual synopses of these cases in the course of the court's own language, which is the court's synopsis of the expert testimony, indicates that that terminology was used appropriately.
No. Do you have any cases specifically on the point of the terminology?
I'm going to find out now because the faxes are coming in. We asked for them last night, and they're coming in this morning. There was a time delay, 3-hour time delay. But I think that the mere fact that we have it used in the guide that Mr. Bailey himself proffered to the court as the Bible on this subject should lay to rest any issues we have with respect to the propriety of that terminology. And I apologize to the court for not having brought it to the court's attention sooner, but there was no way that I could know that this issue was going to be raised by Mr. Bailey or that there was going to be a ruling that there was. It was raised just yesterday.
No, counsel, this is an issue that we discussed informally over the last month. And it's been raised several times.
The issue of the word match in hair?
Absolutely.
Hair and fiber?
Absolutely. This is not a new issue. You go back and find it in the record. I'm certain it's there in the sidebar conversations at least a dozen times.
Then I apologize to the court.
All right, do you have any other comment?
Yes, I'd like the opportunity to present the court with the additional cases that are coming in through fax right now. I apologize to the court then if I was remiss in not having brought these cases to the court sooner. I don't recall having had the issue raised, and I defer to the court's recollection of that. And I would ask that the expert be allowed to use the term
All right, specifically, what terminology are you citing to the court on page 823?
of
Bonin?
Bonin. At the bottom of the page, Your Honor, the last paragraph where it said the prosecution presented expert testimony to the following effect.
Mhm. All right, any other comment?
Yes, Your Honor, I have case in front of me now. I'll first cite to the court from the FBI Forensic Science Research and Training Center, a report prepared in 1982. The relevant language is on the last line. It says, however, the quote-unquote duplicate hair criterion for a match should be the ultimate goal. I'll submit this to Deedrick so the court can see it. Another highlighted passage of this symposium, let me quote, the most important decision made by the hair examiner is deciding when a hair can be said to match or be consistent with originating from a particular individual.
Deputy Magner, would you collect Detective Lang's pager for me, please?
The following cases being sent to us right now, they are out-of-state cases, but they deal with a issue of the terminology.
Well, Ms. Clark, let's cut to the chase here.
There's
Are you
more.
asking for 402 on the terminology match?
Yes, Your Honor. I have more here as well. From Forensic Sciences International. In essence, an investigator attempts to assess the likelihood of matching fibers. Again, matching fibers were found on only 10 garments searched. Results of a study to determine the probability of chance match occurrences between fibers known to be from different sources, a paper written by Wilken Fong and S. Henry Inami, in which the abstract begins with the following. The results of a study to determine the frequency of chance match occurrences among fibers.
All right.
And again, then, in another paper published by Richard Bisbing and Michael Wollner, natural variation does not preclude the association of hair because sometimes variation serves to personalize the hair specimen. When comparing several hairs from one source, it can sometimes be demonstrated that the questioned hair not only has the traits of the known hair, but that the variation in the questioned specimens matches the variation occurring in the exemplar.
All right. I'll hear from the defense.
Shall I?
Mr. Bailey.
On the page 7 from which Ms. Clark read, it is concluded that, based on this comparison, the examiner may conclude, number one, that the hairs are consistent or similar and could have come from the same source. Number two, that the hairs are dissimilar and did not come from the same source. or 3, that the hairs possess characteristics which are not sufficiently defined to arrive at a meaningful conclusion. Only those 3 conclusions are permitted, according to this manual, which, although published in 1977, Mr. Deedrick himself told me on Wednesday has never been republished, updated, or changed or modified. Every book that deals with hair and fiber comparison states it in the same terms. Now, the word match, as used in appellate decisions and used once on this page, is a dangerous word because of the connotations to a layman. When you say a perfect match, you may be talking about a male and a female who are not identical, but who fit together well. The word match normally is interpreted to mean identity. That is, the same in every respect. If this jury is given the idea by these niceties of language which have been deliberately injected, despite your order to the contrary, throughout his testimony, and used by Ms. Clark with some frequency, and the jury gets the impression that this witness is saying this is O.J. Simpson's hair,
Mr. Bailey.
even though he has testified under oath that he can never claim that he has identified a hair as belonging to any one individual, but has subscribed to the limitations in this FBI manual, which I presume he himself, as section chief, would have amended, updated, or rewritten if the rules had somehow changed or the technology advanced to the point where single source identification was possible. I don't believe it's fair to have him on the one hand tell the jury, I can't say that it came from this source, and on the other hand, that's a match. It's confusing, and it runs the risk that one or more jurors will interpret that as a positive identification when it is no such thing and never can be in hair and fiber technology. That's our position on it. We ask that you continue to prohibit the use of the word match simply because the dictionary definition brings it perilously close in the minds of many and in common usage to identity. And that is wrong, unfair, improper, and I believe would be an error, despite the language in appellate decisions which describe microscopic consistency as a match. That is not to say that the examiner who testified in those cases was allowed to use that word in his testimony, and if he was, I suggest that that was improper. The second matter, Your Honor, that I would like to raise before we bring the jury in, we have some concern based on a theory spun out by Ms. Clark as to how the wrapped around hair that you pointed out when we were reviewing the boards a couple of days ago on Nicole Brown's, the wrapped around fiber on Nicole Brown's hair that was found on Goldman's shirt, got that way. She speculated that there may have been something Mr. Simpson was doing as the alleged murderer that caused that to wrap around. I was concerned. I spoke to Mr. Deedrick. He speculates that something was rolling, and that's how it happened. And I would like some kind of voir dire on that, Your Honor, because if he has no real idea and is simply speculating, I don't think the question should be put to him. We do note that when Ms. Clark assured you he would explain how that occurred, he leaned over to Mr. Van Adder and said, I hope. I got the impression from talking with him yesterday that he has no clear idea how it happened and is simply speculating. And I would like to preclude any such speculation if it doesn't have sufficient foundation before the answer is given. And I'd like Your Honor to make some inquiry into that aspect of it, if you will.
All right. Ms. Clark, do you want to address that last issue, the wrapped hair?
One second. This just came in, Your Honor. I'm sure Mr. Deedrick can authenticate it, but from some lawyers in Anchorage, Alaska. They sent us a quote from a transcript in an Anthony case. The strongest statement we make is the hair could have originated from that person. Now, that's the same witness. He said that before you, Your Honor, a couple of times yesterday. and I don't like to see it embellished any further than it already has been. And I would like to see the limitation of the word match that you imposed yesterday enforced with some regularity. Thank you.
Let me assist the court. What we have here is a fundamental lack of understanding on the part of the defense as to apples and oranges here. The finding of a match is what permits the expert to draw the conclusion that the hair could have originated from this person's head. The two are distinct issues. The finding of a match does not mean that they are therefore saying it came from only this individual. And every time this expert, Mr. Deedrick, testifies to the fact that he found a match, it will then be concluded by him that the hair could have originated from Mr. Simpson. He'll never say that the match indicates identity. But unless he finds a match, he cannot even say it could have come from the head of Mr. Simpson or the head of Nicole Brown or Ronald Goldman. That's the issue. And counsel is confused between the terminology that permits the conclusion ultimately to be reached that he just read to you and the finding and the observations that are made that lead to that conclusion. There are three possible conclusions a hair examiner can reach, and Mr. Deedrick is in complete conformity with the Hicks Guide that says of the three, one is that it could have come from the head of a given person. But you cannot reach that conclusion until you have first found a match. And that's why we're talking apples and oranges here. And every time the word match is used by Mr. Deedrick, it will be accompanied by what that means, which is it could have come from the head of whoever. So Mr. Bailey is confused. Those terms do not, it's two separate proceedings and two separate procedures we're talking about. First you find the match, then you draw the conclusion. They are not inconsistent, they do not conflict, and they do not mislead. And that's why in previous decisions, in previous cases, experts have so testified. With respect to how the fiber came to be wrapped around the hair, just as Dr. Lakshmanan gave an educated hypothetical as to how things could have happened based on his on reasonable medical certainty and his expertise, Mr. Deedrick is also an expert of nearly 20 years' experience who may hypothesize based on his expertise and experience and judgment that the fiber could have become wrapped around the hair in a couple of possible ways. One of which is the rolling effect when you brush against, when a fiber, when someone's sleeve brushes against a hair, and then the fiber wraps around the hair. Another possibility, well, I don't have to get into that. But the bottom line is that within his experience and judgment, he can hypothesize, giving the educated, reasonable scientific certainty as to how this could have occurred in his experience. That's his job. He's an expert. That's why we ask him to testify. If he didn't have that experience and didn't know any more than you or I, then why call him? Again, I do not see any possibility of misleading this jury with the use of the term match. The problem we're having with this expert, he's being continually having to say words that he's unaccustomed to saying and phrase his findings in ways that are not the norm for him. And so, yes, he slips. He's not used to doing that. For 18 years, he has done something different. He comes to this court, and now all of a sudden he can't use the term he's been using for 18 years. And that's what's causing the problem. He means no disrespect to the court. And I've been attempting to address the issue with other phraseology, but I find, having researched the literature, that it is found to be acceptable, not only in the scientific community, but in the courts as well.
All right. Thank you. All right, counsel, the problem we have here is we have a wide range of scientific evidence that has been presented here. In Webster's third New International Dictionary, the definition of the word match is as follows: one that is exactly like another, one that forms an exact pair with another, an exact counterpart. So that terminology is too close to, that terminology overstates the power of this evidence, and the court's previous ruling will stand. All right, let's have the jurors. The record reflect that we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Mr. Deedrick, would you resume the witness stand, please? All right, good morning again, Mr. Deedrick.
Good morning.
Yes, sir, you reminded you were still under oath, and Ms. Clark, you may continue with your direct examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning. Mr. Deedrick, when we left off, I was asking you about the significance of finding two fibers a question fiber and a known fiber that exhibited the exact same microscopic characteristics. And what is the significance of that?
Well, a fiber association is significant because of the variation that exists in the environment. That is, there are many different types of fabrics, there's many different types of fibers, both naturally occurring and man-made. And because of this wide diversity, it makes a particular fiber association significant.
Let me ask you this. If I saw two black cotton shirts on a rack, they look the same on the rack. If you were to examine the fibers from the two of them microscopically, has it ever occurred that you've seen two garments that appear the same to the naked eye? When you take fibers from them, you see differences?
Well, many things appear similar, but very few things are the same in all respects. I've done studies in the past to support that.
Did you examine fibers from the evidence in the clothing of the victims in this case?
I did.
Now, in your experience, sir, what is the mobility, what is the transience of fibers in the manner in which they transfer between objects? Is it more or less than hairs?
Well, fibers tend to transfer. Fibers will tend to transfer at a greater rate because of their size being much smaller and lighter. They will transfer more easily than hairs.
And what, if any, significance does that mobility have to you in determining when whether a fiber can be associated with a crime or with a suspect?
Well, when two people come into physical contact, there's a possibility that fibers from the clothing of those individuals may be transferred. It's called a primary transfer. Fibers that are loose on the surface that actually did not come from that garment may be transferred as well. It's called a secondary transfer. Primary from the fabric, an indirect transfer would be secondary, and they occur all the time.
Well, what's an example of a secondary transfer?
Well, a secondary transfer would be one where, for instance, I sat down in this chair and there were fibers from the suit I wore yesterday. I possibly could pick up the fibers from that suit, and it would be secondary. It didn't come directly from the fabric, but indirectly through an intermediary or another surface, fabric surface. So primary transfers or direct contact transfers occur all the time, as well as secondary transfers. And in the laboratory, we look for both types of events.
Can that also happen in the case of hairs, primary and secondary transfer?
The same thing can happen. The hairs can be transferred directly from a body area, such as a head or pubic region. They can also transfer indirectly. That is, hairs that are found on the clothing of a suspect in a case, which may belong or may have originated from that individual, may be transferred during the contact as well, and that's essentially a secondary transfer.
Is it a common occurrence for us to shed hairs onto our clothing on a daily basis?
It's very common to find one's own hairs on one's own clothes.
And then if, for example, a suspect were to shed hairs on his clothing and then have contact with the victim in the course of a violent struggle, might you find hairs from the suspect's clothing, his own hairs, transferred onto the clothing of the victim?
That's very likely to occur, yes.
Have you heard of something called the low-card exchange principle?
I've heard of it, yes.
Can you explain to us what that is?
Well, the low-card exchange principle states that when two objects come into contact, physical contact, there's going to be an exchange of materials. It was originally stated, actually derived from what Mr. Locard had worked on as a French scientist, that when people work in certain environments, they come in contact with certain types of materials, they often will pick up this material on their clothing, thus indicating perhaps the type of job that they have, or what type of vehicle that they may be riding in, or what type of clothing that they're used to wearing, or whether they smoke tobacco or tobacco products. So it was derived from his work that he did in France that dealt with transfer.
And does that principle also go to fibers as well?
Well, same thing. Any type of material, foreign material or material from a fabric could transfer just as easily. Doing the same thing. A person may have a particular type of car. Evidence of this might be found on his clothing. A person may have a particular type of clothing attire, certain types of fabrics that he wears frequently. These fibers may be found on his clothing. So these transfers occur all the time.
Okay, let's move on to this case, Mr. Deedrick. When were you assigned to this case?
Well, the evidence first came in on August 8th, 1994.
And who brought it in?
Susan Brockbank from the Los Angeles Police Department Crime Laboratory.
And was the evidence brought straight to you?
It was, yes.
What exactly is your procedure when you receive evidence from a local agency for analysis?
Well, the evidence is the evidence is taken to what's called the Evidence Control Center. And at this location, a laboratory number is assigned to the case. They indicate in their documentation that is going to be assigned to the Hairs and Fibers unit that I'm going to be what's called the principal examiner in the case. At that point, the evidence was taken to the unit where it was inventoried or checked in.
And when the property is inventoried or checked in, is there some form that's filled out?
Well, a worksheet is prepared in all cases. In this case, it was as well. The question items of evidence are listed numerically, Q item Q1, Q2, Q3, and so forth. And besides each of these Q numbers, an indication of what it is. Q1, hair from a particular item. And besides that, the number generally that identifies it from the police department or Los Angeles Police Department identification number. All of the items are checked in and listed on a worksheet. And from this worksheet, the initial work on the case starts.
So you renumber the items submitted with your own numbering?
Right.
Q for questioned, that means recovered from the crime scene in unknown origin?
These items may contain questioned items that may be suitable for comparison with known samples or Ks.
And all the known samples have a K something, K number?
It starts with K1, K2, K3, and in the initial case as it comes in. As subsequent submissions come into the laboratory, they're run consecutively, starting with where we left off.
So is the worksheet listing out all of your numbering done first before you begin the actual examination?
Yes, that's correct. You can work off of a notebook paper too. You don't need a worksheet to start the work, but it's just a formality. It's part of the documentation.
Okay. Now, before you begin the work of analysis and examination, is there some precaution that is taken in terms of the workspace, the work area?
Well, before you actually start on an individual item to look at it for material, whether it's hair evidence or fiber evidence, those areas are cleaned.
Okay. I mean, with respect to, in this case, the hair and fiber had already been collected from the evidence items such as clothing and hat and
Right.
et cetera. So you were submitted paper folds, correct?
Right. All of the initial items that came in were in sealed either coin envelopes or manila envelopes, and they were inventoried from that. Some of them had to be opened just so that they could be numbered, but the actual coin envelope was not opened at that time.
And was there one item of actual evidence that you did receive with Susan Brockbank on August the 8th?
Well, I consider them all items of evidence, but in actual fabric, I received the hat, the knit hat that was recovered from the scene.
The blue knit cap?
That's correct.
Before you opened the packages that you received, did you make any effort to clean surfaces or take precautions to make sure the workspace was clean?
I'm not sure exactly what stage you're referring to. When the initial check-in, there's paper spread out on the table, and the items are inventoried, but they're all in a sealed condition at that time. As each individual item is ready for examination, the surface is prepared and clean. Clean paper is put down. The forceps or tweezers are clean. Lab coats are worn. All the precautions that we feel necessary to preclude the possibility of contamination.
And is the paper changed and forceps examined for cleanliness between the examination of each item?
Each item, the forceps are examined under the stereo microscope just to be sure that there's nothing on them. Hands are clean, new paper.
And did both you and Susan Brockbank wear white lab coats during the examinations of all items?
Yes, you're right. We did supply her with a lab coat.
All right, earlier did I ask you to examine a board that we have marked as People's 436 entitled a chain of custody board?
Yes, I remember looking at it.
And did you examine all of the items contained on that board to determine whether they accurately reflected the appearance of the items you received for the examination in this case?
Yes, if I could just take one last look.
Please.
All right, Mr. Escobar, you're going to have to move that back because it's blocking out juror number 7. All right, thank you, gentlemen. Ms. Clark, you want to have Mr. Deedrick step down and look at this?
Yes.
The only difference that I see here on this particular board is item number 113, and it indicates that the FBI numbers Q8A, B1, B2, B3, C, they're not actually in the photographs, but they came in that envelope.
And so those are those Q8, Q8A, B1, B2, B3, C, and Q9 through 19, I'll give it to the court reporter later, and Q47 were all the numbers that you assigned to what was removed from the package depicted on this chain board for item 113.
That's correct.
And Q9 through 19, were those slides that were already prepared when they arrived at the FBI on August 8th?
They were, and I believe this one blue mailer here, plastic mailer, is Q9. But there were glass microscope slides prepared and delivered for examination.
So that's an example of what you got?
That's an example, yes.
Then is everything on that board accurate with respect to the packages that you received from LAPD?
It looks accurate, yes.
And does it accurately reflect the dates on which you received these items?
Yes, it does.
not all items were received on August 8th, correct?
That's correct.
Some were received later?
Later.
All right. Oh, but there's one more board, actually.
I'll hang around.
451. All right, this is People's 451, so I also asked, I think, that you look at this earlier to determine whether the information reflected on it concerning what was received by you at the FBI and when is correct.
This board is correct.
Thank you, sir. Sir, with respect to the results of your examinations in this case, before we step into that, I just wanted to ask you in general, with regard to hair comparisons, what conclusions can you draw from the comparison of hairs? And what, in your opinion, is the significance of hairs that exhibit the same exact microscopic characteristics?
If hairs exhibit the same microscopic characteristics, it indicates that these hairs could have originated from that individual. If hairs are different, and they're different, significantly different, it's possible to say that this hair or hairs could not have originated from a given individual. On some occasions, similarities in characteristics and differences both exist, and no conclusion may be reached regarding that type of comparison. So essentially, there are three conclusions that are reached.
In your examination of the hairs collected from the evidence in this case, sir, did you find any hairs that match those of Nicole Brown?
Move to strike.
Sustained. With the court reporter, please. Proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Great. In your examination of the hairs collected from the evidence items in this case, sir, did you find any hairs that exhibited the same microscopic characteristics as those of Nicole Brown?
I did.
And were these head hairs, sir?
They were.
Where did you find those hairs?
These hairs were found on the glove identified as originating from the Rockingham location, a glove found at the Bundy location, as well as from the knit hat that was recovered at the Bundy location. Hairs that exhibited the same characteristics as those of Nicole Brown Simpson were also found on the pants and shirt of Ronald Goldman.
Now, have you seen each of those items that you've just described? The glove recovered at Rockingham, the glove recovered at Bundy, the blue knit cap recovered at Bundy, and the pants and shirt of Ronald Goldman?
I have, yes.
And I'm going to direct your attention to the monitor. These are items previously marked in evidence, Your Honor. Okay, this is People's 55G.
Right, 55G appears to be a photo of the Rockingham glove.
And this is People's. Do you recognize this item as well, sir?
Well, it looks like a glove at a crime scene.
Okay. Does it look like one of the two gloves that you saw in this case?
One of the gloves I did look at came from the Bundy crime scene. I believe this is that glove.
People's 45A.
All right, appears to be the Bundy glove.
Oh, this is kind of hard to see. The photograph on the screen now is People's 56. On laser, and it's a little difficult to see, Your Honor. I'm going to ask to zoom it in on the Elmo if I can. People's 56I. You recall you indicated earlier that on August 8th, one item of the actual fabric itself was transported to you. You remarked the blue knit cap. Does this appear to be that cap?
It does, yes.
Your Honor, you might need to cut the feed for this photo.
People's 43F. And the pants and shirt belonging to Ronald Goldman, do you recall having seen those items, sir?
Yes, I do.
And do those appear to be them?
They do.
And those are the items on which you found the head hairs of Nicole Brown that appear to exhibit the same microscopic characteristics as those of Nicole Brown.
No.
Yes, there were hairs that were found on these items that exhibited the same microscopic characteristics as the known hairs submitted to me from Nicole Brown Simpson.
And I have a board here, Your Honor. I'd ask you to mark People's next in order. People's
475.
475. I'm going to remove the strip concerning Nicole Brown to reveal the results just testified to by Mr. Deedrick. Did any of the hairs that you found on either of the gloves or the clothing of Mr. Goldman appear to be forcibly removed?
The one hair on the Rockingham glove did appear to be forcibly removed. It's approximately 12 inches long and was broken at the proximal end, or at the end nearest the point of attachment near the skin. The hairs from Ronald Goldman's shirt, which was my Q23, there were about 35 forcibly removed hairs exhibiting the same microscopic characteristics as those of Nicole Brown Simpson.
And what about the hairs that were on the Bundy glove? What did those hairs look like?
They were fragments. Actually, it was a treated head hair fragment.
And when you say fragments, what does that mean?
Well, it's a portion of a hair. There was no root present on the hair.
What about the hairs that could have come from Nicole Brown that you found on Ron Goldman's pants and knit hat? What did those hairs look like?
They were fragmentary as well, under 3.5 inches. No roots were present on any of these.
Were they naturally shed?
No. A naturally shed hair will have a root that has a club shape, like I previously testified to, and none of these had roots of that condition.
None of these, in other words, none of the hairs that could have come from Nicole Brown had the appearance, roots the appearance of which would show that they were naturally shed?
They did not.
Did you prepare a chart depicting the microscopic appearance of the hairs, the known head hairs of Nicole Brown, and the hairs that you determined could have come from her from the evidence items?
I did.
Mr. Fairtlow, we may need to raise that up.
This is as high as this particular easel goes. I can't swap out easels.
Let's swap easels. Because the bottom is obstructed by the projector here. Back as far as you can so you don't block the witness. Can you see that? All right, 165, can you see that? Yes, sir. Thank you. Ms. Clark.
All right, now, does this depict all of the hairs of Nicole Brown, Nicole Brown's known exemplar that you determined to exhibit the same microscopic characteristics as the hair recovered from the evidence in this case?
I don't believe all of the hairs, the question hairs, were photographed and that are represented on that board.
Is this a representative sample of what you saw under the microscope?
It is, yes.
If you would, sir, could you please step down and explain to the jury what it is that you saw that was significant to you to cause you to come to the conclusion you did with respect to the hairs that are depicted on this board that I asked if you marked People's 476?
476.
Okay, with respect to question hair number 1, it was a 12-inch long hair that was recovered from identified as recovered from the Rockingham glove. I photographed an area of the known, which was K4, a known sample number 4 from Nicole Brown Simpson, and an area from the Rockingham glove, again, that being Q1. Always keep in mind that these photographs are about 250 magnification, and I'm just representing an area that appeared to me to be similar microscopically. I'm not trying to do an entire hair examination for you, I'm just trying to represent what the area that I saw that exhibited the same characteristics. The hair also appeared to be lighter in certain areas. Another hair from the Rockingham glove had some coloration to it, or bleaching, or something that altered the color and made it lighter. So that's another hair that was recovered from the Rockingham glove. 7B was recovered from the Bundy glove. Again, that was, I believe, about 6 inches long or so, and it did not have a root. As you can see, there's a range of color, as people have, depending on the hairs that you're attempting to compare. K4 is an area that has been very lightened, and again, artificially lightened hair that was recovered. This is the same hair, an area of one portion of the hair and the area of the hair which is further out nearest to the tip. This known sample was compared with Q23, and again, I mentioned there were about 35 hairs to compare it to, but this is just one of the hairs. The last photograph depicts the condition of the roots that were present in both the known sample and the question sample. Again, this just indicating how a hair would look if it's been forcibly removed. The reddish substance that you see appears to be blood.
Now, you earlier spoke to us about the range of characteristics that you'll find on the head of any individual. Do these hairs that you photographed here, from the known sample of Ms. Brown, exhibit that range of characteristics you spoke of?
Yes, you can see that there's a range, that not all hairs are all duplicates of each other, that some hairs are lighter, some hairs are darker, some hairs have medulation, some hairs don't. It just depends upon the range of characteristics of that individual. And here you see that an area of the hair that probably was down a little bit further near the base was a little bit darker, whereas some hairs were lighter in certain portions of the hair. This piece of hair that was recovered from, identified as coming from the Rockingham glove, would have been probably a more distal portion, out towards the tip, as opposed to a full-length hair, which would indicate a darker portion of the hair. The same thing with the hair fragment that came from the Bundy glove. It's probably a distal portion, as opposed to something that's nearer to the base of the hair.
When you say the base of the hair, what end is that?
That's proximal, nearest to the skin.
To the scalp?
That's right, where it's attached.
Now, you indicated earlier in your testimony that when you do a hair examination, you look through the whole length of the hair, the entire hair, correct?
Right, you look through everything that you have to compare. Some hairs may be 3.5 or less. Some hairs may be 12 inches, like in this particular case. So that when the comparison process involves looking for hairs in the known sample that compare both by the length and how the characteristics change along the length, and also doing regional type comparisons if you have portions of hair. That is, if a hair portion, if the question is, could this portion of hair have come from that individual, the comparison would be with areas of the hair that have the same microscopic characteristics, which might be out at the end of the hair. So the comparison is based on what you have.
Now, you indicated that this was like 250 times magnification.
It's approximately 250 times, yes.
So, do these photographs depict the entire length of the hair that you saw when you performed your examination?
No. For instance, if I wanted to photograph serial photographs of each section of that hair, it would be like 25 feet long. So, we don't do that. We just try to take an area that appears to represent the conclusion that's being drawn from that comparison.
Okay, you only photographed, I think, on this board, 2 of the hairs you determined to exhibit the same microscopic characteristics as Nicole Brown on the Rockingham glove. In this board, they're both labeled Q1 on the far left as I face it.
That's right.
How many hairs did you actually find on the Rockingham glove that exhibited the same microscopic characteristics as the hairs of Nicole Brown?
I believe there were 4 that were recovered from that item.
Can you describe what those hairs on the Rockingham glove look like?
As I said, the one it was approximately 12 inches long, and it was broken at the proximal end, or nearest to where the hair attaches itself to the scalp. The others were fragments. Again, I don't recall the exact length, but they were shorter fragments.
Is there any significance to the fact, sir, that you found the same microscopic characteristics in several questioned hairs, that is, hairs collected from the evidence in this case, as the known standard for Nicole Brown?
Well, the more associations that are made between hairs that vary a little bit in characteristics, the more significant that association is, because you're associating different hairs that also appear in the known sample.
How many hairs did you find that exhibited the same microscopic characteristics as those of Nicole Brown on the Bundy glove?
There was one.
And how many hairs did you find on Mr. Goldman's shirt that exhibited the same microscopic characteristics as those of Nicole Brown?
There were approximately 35 on the shirt.
Were they forcibly removed or naturally shed?
As I said, they were forcibly removed.
What, in your experience, sir, could account for the hairs that exhibited the same microscopic characteristics of those of Nicole Brown on Ron Goldman's shirt?
Either a primary or a secondary transfer. Either came there directly from the head of Nicole Brown Simpson, or they were transported there as a secondary transfer.
Pose for you a hypothetical, if I may. You indicated that the finding of hairs that exhibited the same microscopic characteristics as those of Nicole Brown on Ron Goldman's shirt could be there by primary or secondary transfer. If you would assume the following events, sir, that the killer pulled back Nicole's head with his left hand, in order to slit her throat with his right hand, and then went over to Ron Goldman for a final attack, touching him in the process with the hand that held Nicole's hair by the head. Could that account for the hairs that you found on Ron Goldman's shirt?
He hasn't qualified in this area.
Overruled.
Yes, that could account for the presence of those hairs.
You also indicated that you found more hairs that exhibited the same microscopic characteristics as those of Nicole Brown on the Rockingham glove than on the Bundy glove, correct?
That's correct.
Now, are you aware that the Bundy glove was found at the scene of the crime, of the murder,
I am, yes.
and that the Rockingham glove was found at the defendant's residence?
I am, yes.
What does that finding indicate to you, based on your experience, with respect to how long each of those gloves remained on the hands of the killer during the murders?
Sustained.
You indicated earlier, sir, that with respect to fibers, they move freely, more freely than hairs, correct?
Yes, they do transfer more easily.
Let me pose this to you in the form of a hypothetical. if the killer, while wearing both gloves, launched an initial attack on Nicole by knocking her unconscious, having very limited contact with her in that initial contact, and then subsequently lost the Bundy glove early in the struggle with Ron Goldman, could that account for the fact that you found more of the hairs that exhibited the same microscopic characteristics as Nicole Brown's hair on the Rockingham glove than on the Bundy glove?
Sustained. It's not appropriate hypothetical. Let me see counsel sidebar. Without the report.
Trying to remember how many you said. You indicated to us, sir, that you've worked on how many hair and fiber cases?
4,000 or so.
And what percentage of those 4,000 involve stabbings?
Well, many, a lot of stabbing cases.
And have you made certain observations in the course of the work you've done on those stabbing cases concerning what kind of hair transfers and fiber transfers you're likely to find?
Well, surprisingly, with stabbing cases, hair transfers between the assailant and the victim are not commonly found.
And why is that?
It may be the fact that it's at arm's length as opposed to a lot of direct physical contact between the bodies.
That's speculation.
And you base that on?
Just based on what I've seen over the years, looking at the clothing worn by individuals suspected of being involved in stabbings and also from the victims. The best evidence that is seen many times in stabbing cases are the fiber transfers that are present on the knife or the weapon that is recovered from a suspect in a case. And that generally is the best evidence and most commonly seen, more so than hair transfers.
And in those cases, have you had occasion to examine items of evidence that bore the hairs that exhibited the same microscopic characteristics as the hairs of the victims?
I don't know if I quite understand that
Okay.
question.
In this particular case, you examined the Rockingham and the Bundy gloves, correct?
That's right.
And you examined also the hair and fiber collected from those gloves, correct?
I did.
And you found hairs that exhibited the same microscopic characteristics on both gloves as those seen in the hairs of Nicole Brown.
That's correct.
And you found more of such hairs on the Rockingham glove than the Bundy glove.
That's right.
In your past experience in other stabbing cases, have you found hairs consistent with those of the victims on various items of evidence at the crime scene?
I don't think I can answer this question that you're posing based on past experience. I've seen a lot of different things. I can't be specific in this instance.
Have you ever had cases where you've found more hair on one item than on another that is consistent with that of a victim?
Sure, and it just depends on the nature of the contact. One can derive certain conclusions from the presence of hair evidence on certain items, indicating that perhaps more contact may have occurred with that particular item. as to where the source of the material came from.
And as a matter of your expertise and simple reason and logic, would it be fair to state that an item of clothing worn for a very short period of time during an attack will be likely to have less hair and fiber than an item worn for a longer period of time during the attack?
Objection, argumentative, speculative.
Well, the shorter the duration of the contact, many times the less amount of material that may be picked up or transferred to another item.
All right, in your examination of the hairs and fibers collected from the evidence in this case, did you find any hairs that you found to exhibit the same microscopic characteristics as those of Ronald Goldman?
I did.
And again, were those head hairs?
They were.
And where did you find those head hairs, sir?
Well, there were hairs that were recovered from Mr. Goldman's shirt, which was my Q23, and there were also hairs recovered from the Rockingham glove. You indicated you found those hairs on the Rockingham glove I did.
that exhibited the same microscopic characteristics as those of Ron Goldman.
That's right.
And did those hairs appear to be naturally shed or forcibly removed?
They were cut and torn.
Then the hairs that you found on Ron Goldman's shirt that you determined to exhibit the same microscopic characteristics as his known hair, what appearance did they have?
They were both cut, torn, and forcibly removed. Well, they're all forcibly removed, but in the sense that some had roots, some didn't.
And how many of the hairs consistent with those of Ron Goldman did you find on the Rockingham glove?
There were 3.
3?
That's correct. Wait, excuse me. Well, I had several in my notes.
What does that mean? Several.
Well, it could be 3 or 4.
Did you prepare a chart to demonstrate what you saw through the microscope and what you based your conclusion on?
I did.
Now, again, does this depict all of the questioned hairs that you determined were consistent with the known sample of Ron Goldman, or only a representative sample?
It's a representation.
All right, this will be marked 477.
477.
Excuse me, counsel over at the sidebar, please, with the court reporter. Thank you, counsel. Proceed.
And this is People's 477. If you would step down, Mr. Deedrick, and explain to the jury what it is you're trying to show with these photographs.
Okay, again, these are photographs at about 250 magnification. The known sample, these 2 photographs were taken from the actual hairs that were submitted from Ronald Goldman. This portion of hair here that you see identifies from the Rockingham glove. this particular portion of the hair came from Mr. Goldman's shirt. Comparison over on the far right represents a hair. It's one of the hairs that actually came off of his shirt, and there were a lot of hairs that were on his shirt. The other hair identified from the Rockingham glove is represented by the bottom photograph. They certainly indicate a pretty good range of characteristics, from medullated hairs, which have a dark medulla, to trace or discontinuous, and also the same present on the other hairs.
May the record reflect that when the witness referred to medullated hairs, those that have a dark medulla, he was referring to the photographs to the very far left, which is labeled as K1, and the photograph under that labeled Q3C, hair from Rockingham glove.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, sir. Now, Mr. Deedrick, did you find any human hairs in the paper fold marked Q3A, which was hair removed from the Rockingham glove, that did not exhibit the same microscopic characteristics as either Ron Goldman or Nicole Brown?
Could I refresh my memory, please?
Certainly.
Thank you. Yes, there was one short Caucasian head hair, about 1 inch long, light brown, that was dissimilar to the known hair standards that I received.
Was that hair naturally shed or forcibly removed?
It was a naturally shed hair.
Now, were the hair standards that you received that were taken by the coroner from Ron Goldman, were those naturally shed hairs or forcibly removed?
They were all forcibly removed.
Does that have any impact on your ability to make an effective comparison between questioned hair and known hair standard?
Well, it's much easier to compare, again, apples with apples, oranges with oranges. The hairs that are forcibly removed will compare better with hairs that are forcibly removed. The same thing is with naturally shed hairs. As a hair reaches the stage where it's ready to come out, it tends to look a little different. It often gets lighter. It loses a lot of the medulation or the canal that's found in the center of the hair, and it will look different. That's why I request combings as well as pullings when known samples are collected.
And did you have any such combings in the standard submitted to you from the coroner's office
I did not.
for Ronald Goldman?
That's correct.
All right, did you receive and examine hair samples from police and crime personnel and laboratory personnel that were involved in this case?
I did.
And did those samples include Detectives Phillips, Furman, Van Adder, and Lang?
It did, yes.
Did you compare their known hair standards of those detectives to this one inch light brown hair on the Rockingham glove?
I did.
And what was the result?
The one question hair from the Rockingham glove could not have originated from these individuals.
Any of them?
Not from the individuals you just mentioned. None of the elimination standards exhibited the same characteristics.
Your Honor, I have another board that I'd like to be marked as People's 478.
478.
Board that we've just asked you mark 478 is elimination head hair samples.
Yes.
If you would step down, sir, and take a look at this board. There are names underneath each of the photographs. There's one photograph for each name, correct?
That's correct.
And did you cause those photographs to be taken, sir?
I took the photographs, yes.
And do those represent all of the all of the lab and crime scene police personnel whose head hair standards were sent to you for comparison purposes?
Right. It's my understanding that these people were either at the crime scene or associated with the evidence in some way.
And are these a representative hair of each of them? What is this?
It's just a representation of hairs that were found in the known samples from each individual. The comparison process that I talked about previously with the hair from the Rockingham glove was not compared with the photographs. The hair was compared with the actual samples. This is just a representation of the hairs of each individual.
So when you made your comparison, sir, you didn't compare photographs, correct?
I never compare photographs. No.
The photographs are just for demonstration to the jury?
Just as an illustration, just for the jury to see what I was seeing under the microscope.
With respect to all of these hair samples, did any of them even come close to having the same microscopic characteristics as the hair that you've described from the Rockingham glove, that light brown Caucasian hair?
Well, we're playing with words again. I mean, light brown is light brown, but microscopically, these hairs do not exhibit the same microscopic characteristics.
Sir, of all the known hair samples you received in this case from the police, the lab personnel, the crime scene personnel, and the two victims, Ron Goldman and Nicole Brown, and did you do your own as well?
I did my own, just to make sure it wasn't one of mine.
So you even compared your own hair to that one light brown Caucasian hair on the Rockingham glove?
I did.
Okay, of all of the samples that you compared, including those of Ron Goldman and Nicole Brown, was there any one sample that did come close to exhibiting the same microscopic characteristics as those in the short light brown Caucasian hair on the Rockingham glove?
The only sample that had an area of the hair that was close was the known sample from Ronald Goldman, and that would have been the proximal portion of the hair only, that nearest the root.
And that hair on the Rockingham glove, that was naturally shed?
That was naturally shed, and it was about an inch long, right. And his hairs were about 5 or so, 5.5.
And you had no naturally shed hairs from the coroner's office for Ronald Goldman?
I did not.
Do people shed their hairs, I think you indicated earlier, naturally every day on their clothing, correct?
I've read 100 hairs a day may be shed during the day.
Okay. Let me pose to you a hypothetical, sir. If Ronald Goldman, at the time that he was attacked, had naturally shed hairs already on his shirt, and then was attacked by the killer wearing the glove found at Rockingham, could that account for the naturally shed hair found on the Rockingham glove that did not exactly exhibit the same characteristics microscopically as those of Ronald Goldman?
Objection.
I've stated previously that hairs can be transferred either directly from the head, which would be a primary type transfer, or secondarily. Hairs that are found on the clothing of an individual may be transferred during that contact just as well, and it happens frequently. So the possibility does exist that that hair may have been on the clothing of Ron Goldman during the contact and been exchanged.
Now, did you find any of the hairs that are consistent with those of Ron Goldman on the Bundy glove?
I did not.
And could the Bundy glove coming off early in the struggle with Ron Goldman account for that lack of hair found on that glove? Well, what in your experience, sir, would account for the failure to find any of hairs consistent with Ron Goldman on the Bundy glove?
Objection, lack of foundation.
Sustained.
All right, you did find cut, torn, and forcibly removed hairs on the Rockingham glove consistent with those of Ron Goldman, correct?
Well, they were cut and torn, and again, that's forcible removal. Those were found on the Rockingham glove.
Let me give you the following hypothetical with respect to the findings on that glove, sir. If the attacker is wearing that Rockingham glove and holding the knife in his right hand, which is the Rockingham glove hand, and stabs Ron Goldman in the head and neck area, are those circumstances consistent with the cut and damaged hairs that you found that were collected from the Rockingham glove?
Objection, foundation, speculation.
Yes, they would be consistent with that.
Now, did you find any hairs consistent with those of Ron Goldman in the hair and fiber evidence recovered from Nicole's dress?
I did not.
Sir, in your experience, what is more conducive to the transfer of hair and fiber during an attack? One in which there is extensive contact with the victim, between the victim and killer, or one in which there is very limited contact?
Well, from my experience and also from studies that have been done regarding transfer and persistence of materials, the longer the duration, the more involved the contact, up to a certain point, the greater the amount of material that's going to be transferred back and forth.
So let me ask you this hypothetical, sir. If the killer, after having stabbed and incapacitated Ron Goldman, went over to Nicole and limited the contact with her to merely pulling back her head with his left hand in order to slash her throat without having any further contact with her body, are those events consistent with the fact that you found none of the hairs consistent with Ron Goldman on her clothing?
Objection, speculation.
Well, the more limited the contact, as I said, the less likely that hair and fiber evidence might be found. So again, not knowing all the circumstances, I can only go by experience, and you're talking about a time factor and a contact factor. The more limited the time, the more limited the contact, the less likely you're going to find evidence of a transfer.
Okay. And you're not saying, sir, that the events had to happen just the way I've described, only that it is a reasonable and logical conclusion in your experience and judgment?
Objection, leading.
Sustained.
Are you saying that the events had to happen exactly as I've described in my hypothetical, sir?
No. I can only go by what I see. There are some indications of directionality, but there's no way to know with absolute certainty the events.
Then on what do you base your opinion that the events I described are a reasonable conclusion based on what you found in the evidence?
Objection.
Well, the amount of evidence and the location of the evidence indicates to me that the directionality went from Nicole Brown Simpson to Ronald Goldman in that direction, as opposed to coming back, in as much as there's nothing on her items from Ronald Goldman.
Ms. Clark, 5 minutes.
Thank you. All right, then, as a very basic and simple conclusion, can you draw the conclusion based on your findings that the killer wore the Rockingham glove during the attack on both Nicole Brown and Ronald Goldman?
Objection, leading.
Sustained.
What conclusion can you draw, sir, from the fact that you found hairs consistent with both Nicole Brown and Ronald Goldman on the Rockingham glove concerning whether or not it was worn during their attack?
Well, it's clear to me, based on what I see and what I know about the significance of hair examinations, that that glove was there at the crime scene.
All right, now you also indicated that you received, well, I don't know if you did or not yet. Did you receive hairs? Your Honor, may I peel off the results concerning Ronald Goldman?
Yes. And you're referring to Exhibit
475?
475.
475, thank you. All right, when you first received the hair and fiber evidence collected in this case, sir, on August 8th, did you find any animal hairs in your examination of the evidence?
I did.
And did you determine what kind of animal hairs those were?
Most of the animal hairs were dog hairs.
Now, I think you indicated earlier in your testimony yesterday, sir, that you can determine the difference between animal hairs and human hairs.
Yes, I can.
And how do you do that?
By microscopic structure of the hair. The root is different. It has a different shape. The medulla looks different. The scale patterns look different. There are a lot of characteristics. They're pretty easy to distinguish animal hairs from human hairs.
Can you tell the difference between dog hairs and cat hairs?
I can, yes.
How do you do that?
Same thing. Just a lot of it's just experience and looking at the microscopic characteristics and looking at animal hairs for a lot of years.
Can you identify different breeds of dogs through your microscopic comparison?
That is
Yeah.
possible to do, yes.
When you conducted the examination of the dog hair samples in this case, did you make any determinations concerning the breed?
I did not attempt to do that initially.
And why is that?
Well, I had no particular reason to do it at the time. I was focusing most of my attention on the human hairs as opposed to the animal hairs.
At some point, did you attempt to make that determination in this case?
Well, I did receive animal hair, dog hair standards at a later date, and using those hair standards, I conducted my comparisons.
But as of August 8th, you only had questioned hairs, that is, hairs recovered from the evidence?
That's all I had, yes.
No known standards taken from particular dogs?
I did not.
Can you say that a particular dog hair came from any one particular dog?
Unless I pull it myself, I can't.
And why is that?
Well, because animal hairs, such as dog hairs, do not possess enough individuality in their microscopic characteristics to say with certainty that it originated from that dog, let's say, to the exclusion of other similar dogs. For instance, if there's a white Akita, 2 or 3 white Akitas that have the same markings and have the same apparent hair color, their hairs may look very similar. So it would be difficult to say it came from one dog and not another.
So what does it mean when you say that this questioned dog hair has the same microscopic characteristics as the known sample collected from this particular dog?
Essentially, it means that that question hair or hairs could have originated from that dog. This is just another piece in the puzzle.
And you indicated that known dog hair samples were submitted to you from Cato the dog and from Chachi?
They were, yes.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our mid-morning break at this time. Please remember all of my admonitions to you, and we'll see you back here in about 15 minutes. All right, Mr. Deedrick, you can step down. Counsel, before we conclude with Mr. Deedrick, any comment regarding a proposal to view the crime scene one additional time? I anticipated a response by yesterday did not receive a response from either side, so I anticipate both sides are withdrawing their request.
Actually, Your Honor, I believe that we expected, the people understood that everyone agreed to it, and so felt there was no response necessary other than to pick the appropriate date. That I thought was the only open question, and perhaps I'm wrong, but the people would think it would urge the court to do so. I think it would be very helpful to the jury to get a sense of the conditions that actually prevailed as close as they can to the night in question. The only thing that we would ask is that we do so at the appropriate phase of the moon, which I think the court has already determined.
Well, if you saw the memo that was prepared by Mr. Byrne,
And
but
I
I
think-
have the feeling that there's so much unnatural ambient lighting that any phase of the moon at that particular location is probably irrelevant.
That may be true.
All right,
But-
what's the defense position?
Your Honor, after having gone back to the scene and reviewing it, the conditions have changed dramatically in terms of foliage, growth, patterns, and lighting, and therefore it does not properly, in our opinion, replicate the situation on the night of the murders. Since the jury has already been out once, and since it is a very costly and time-consuming endeavor, and it is our desire to present our case as quickly and as expeditiously as possible, and to get this case to the jury as quickly as possible, it is our position that an additional view is unwarranted and unnecessary, and we object.
All right, do you have any photographic comparisons of the location to depict the change in shrubbery?
No, we do not, Your Honor. That was just done visually by myself and other lawyers and investigators.
All right. Ms. Clark?
Well, had I known that the defense was going to oppose this, which is something they initially were in favor of, I think that we would have presented points and authorities to the court. We think it is the appropriate thing to do. The court can make the determination as to the change in conditions, but according to those who have been recently to the scene, as recently as this morning, it's my understanding that not only has the scene not dramatically changed, but it has changed indeed very little in terms of the foliage and the conditions in which the bodies, of the scene in which the bodies were found. So I would urge the court to, what we could do is have photographs taken for the court's benefit to review, to determine in its judgment whether you feel that the conditions have changed, or perhaps the court would like to take a visit to the scene. I know, and you'll have a motorcade. So perhaps it would be best if we submitted photographs to the court, but I think it is important for the jurors to see the condition of that scene at nighttime, which is really the representative condition of the scene.
All right, is that the only scene that you wish to have a viewing of?
Yes, Your Honor, it is.
So you would forego anything at Rockingham?
Yes, Your Honor, we would. Would the court like us to have photographs taken?
Well, it's either that or I have to go out there myself and look. I would prefer that you have photographic comparison of the two before and after.
Okay. Okay, fine. We will do that. Yes, I'm
Right.
sure if a court went out there, it would be a parade. So in order to
I
avoid
think I could manage it. But I would prefer, since my schedule is rather tight between now and Wednesday.
Sure.
But I do need to make a decision this week
Okay.
and notify both the sheriff's department and the police department because of their logistics and staffing requirements.
Okay. We'll have daytime photographs taken because that would make it easiest, I suppose, for the court to,
Well, the foliage is what I need to know.
Exactly,
Since
that's-
that's the representation.
we'll do that. Thank you, Your Honor.
All right. Sure.
Your Honor, one of our concerns is the overlying tree foliage and the growth patterns of the trees
Oh, I
as
understand.
compared
I understand.
to the incident. Also, even though we do object to any view, if the court decides to have a view, we would respectfully suggest that both areas be viewed, Rockingham and Bundy. However, our position is that neither should be viewed.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's have the jurors, please.
May I indicate one thing, Your Honor? Just take a second. That if the court determines a Rockingham view is appropriate, given the issues involved, there is no interior issue with respect to Rockingham at night. And if the court determines it to be appropriate, it would be solely exterior through the gates, if anything, which we submit.
It's relevant to what Mr. Park said he
Correct.
could see and what Mr. Kalin said he could see.
Although they'd have to take the tarp down that's presently over the gate, because that is a substantial change in circumstance. And I don't know if that foliage is the same either, so
Well,
we
we'll
come to
get
the
there.
same issue.
That issue is nighttime lighting.
Correct?
Oh.
Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Mr. Robson.
Defense that I'm going to be using the board concerning the dog hair comparisons, but we are not going to go into the Chachi hairs, and so I've asked that those photographs be blocked out. At a later time, I'm going to ask permission of the court to either crop the board or remount on a different board the photographs that we're talking about. For now,
Right.
they're covered.
All right, let the record reflect that we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Mr. Deedrick, would you resume the witness stand, please? All right, Ms. Clark, you may continue with your direct examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Deedrick, when we left off, we were talking about dog hairs. Did you compare the dog hairs that you found from the crime scene, the victim's clothing, and the glove at Rockingham to the known samples collected from Nicole's dog, Cato?
I did.
Did any of those dog hairs removed from the evidence in this case exhibit the same microscopic characteristics as those of the dog, Cato?
Yes, they did.
Which ones?
With reference to the Rockingham glove, there were a number of fur hairs that were found. And I believe I need to go into some distinction here as to what fur hairs means. Fur hairs are the underlying soft hairs that form the underbelly, undercoat of animals. Guard hairs are the coarser hairs, the larger hairs that make up the outer coat, for instance, of a dog. So they're called guard hairs and fur hairs. The finer hairs, the softer hairs would be fur hairs. And on the Rockingham glove, there were fur hairs. On the Bundy glove, on the outside of the Bundy glove, there was a guard hair. On the knit hat, on the outside, tan and black hairs, because the Akita also had black hairs in the standard. There were a number of hairs recovered from Goldman's shoes, pants, and shirt. All of these being white in color. All of these compared with the Akita known standard.
What is the distinction, if any, sir, between your ability to compare microscopically fur hairs and guard hairs?
Well, the best hairs to compare are guard hairs because they often give more color variation. They're also larger hairs to work with. The fur hairs have a little less value. However, when used together, they increase the significance of the identification.
All right, now the finding of those hairs consistent with those of Cato the dog around in the area of the items found at the crime scene at Bundy, what, if anything, does that indicate to you with respect to the access of that dog to that location?
It wouldn't surprise me to find dog hairs on the items from the crime scene area if that's where the dog spends a lot of time, because the dog is going to shed hairs as well.
Now, you also found dog hair consistent with that of Cato the dog on the Rockingham glove?
I did, yes.
How many?
Well, I'd have to check on that if I could, please.
Please, thank you.
I have no specific counts. There were several hairs that were recovered from the Rockingham glove.
Okay, and in your experience, when you say several, what do you mean?
3 or 4 hairs.
Now, those were fur hairs, correct?
That's right.
So what is the strength of your conclusion concerning the fact that the hairs you found on the Rockingham glove were consistent with those of Cato the dog?
Well, the conclusion is that the hairs could have originated from the dog. They exhibited the same microscopic characteristics.
And did you create a board to depict some of the comparisons that you made between the known exemplars from Nicole's dog Cato and the hairs recovered from the evidence that would be the Rockingham and Bundy gloves?
I did.
These were not the only areas where you found those hairs, correct?
Well, there were a number of other hairs that I didn't photograph.
And you've already indicated to us where those were found. Those were the items found at the Bundy crime scene?
Right. Most of the hairs were from items from the crime scene. That's correct.
I have a board here, Your Honor, entitled Dog Hair Comparisons, asked that it be marked Peoples 478.
8.
Thank you.
Excuse me, 479.
479. Would you step down, sir, please, and describe to the jury what you have attempted to depict in these photographs?
All right, the known hair sample from Cato, the Akita, is up on the top. You can see differences right off in diameter of the hair and also some of the microscopic characteristics. Hairs that are found on dog, I mentioned, could be fur hairs. They can also be the larger guard hairs. Dogs also have hairs that are intermediate. They go somewhere in between in size and microscopic characteristics, and they're termed intermediate hairs. This one may be leaning towards intermediate because it's a little bit larger. All same magnification, about 250 times. The medulla on fur hairs often may take on this characteristic, just broken up a little bit, as opposed to larger hairs which may have a continuous medulla. And quite a bit difference here in the diameter of it.
Wait, for the record, when the witness said broken up medulla, he was referring to the photograph in the upper left labeled K54, and then as opposed to this or this, and he gestured to the 2 photographs to the right of that, also labeled K54 on this diagram.
Thank you.
Bottom photographs, the 3 photographs, represent the glove recovered at Rockingham, both the finer fur hair as well as a hair that is a little bit larger in diameter and still probably a fur hair. These would be represented by photographs labeled Q1 and Q3C. The other photograph, Q7B, is a guard hair that was recovered from the Bundy glove. And it was compared, as you see here, with the photograph above it, which is K54.
Sir, with respect to the hairs you found on the Rockingham glove consistent with Cato the dog, you indicated that you found 3 or 4. You wrote several in your report, correct?
That's right.
Is the finding of such hairs on the Rockingham glove accounted for by possible contact between the wearer of that glove, the murderer, and Cato the dog, either during or immediately after the murders?
Could have. It could have been a direct transfer from the dog, or, as I stated before, an indirect transfer from hairs at the crime scene.
That were, say, where?
On the ground, maybe? Would have to have been on the ground.
Have to have been on the ground?
Or perhaps from one of the victims who had been on the ground and collected the hairs.
Reveal the results on the Murder and Trace Summary Board, People's 475 for Cato the dog, Your Honor.
Yes.
Could you examine that results board thus far, Mr. Deedrick, and tell us whether or not they accurately reflect your conclusions in this case?
That's correct. It's fine.
And for the record, Your Honor, we are now showing a photograph of Nicole's dog, Cato, Peoples 48.
Nicole's dog. It's not Nicole's dog.
Oh, well. Let's see.
Sir, did you examine, in your examination of the hairs collected from the evidence in this case, did you find any hairs that were not of Caucasian origin?
I did.
And of what origin were they?
From a black individual.
Were they head hairs?
Yes, and limb hairs.
And by limb hairs, you mean?
Arm or leg.
And where did you find those head and limb hairs? From which items of evidence were they collected?
Well, the head hairs were identified as coming from a cap from a Bronco, a knit hat that was recovered from the crime scene, a Ronald Goldman shirt, and those were the items.
Okay. And where was it that you found limb hairs, sir?
That would have been the Rockingham glove and Ronald Goldman shirt.
And these limb hairs were also of the origin of a black person?
That's correct.
Did you examine hairs collected from a cap found in the defendant's Bronco?
I did.
Peoples 439, Your Honor. Now, what kind of hairs did you find collected from this cap, sir?
Well, there were 2 head hairs that appeared to be naturally shed.
And what condition were they in?
Well, they appeared, some of them had chew marks present on them. They looked like normal head hairs naturally shed.
And what does that mean, chew marks?
Well, hairs that may lay around for a while. And in vehicles, it's not uncommon to see hairs that have been chewed on by either a beetle or some other insect. They take a while to chew through them, so when we get to them, they just looks like a bite mark's been taken out of them.
And that's not uncommon to find.
Well, it just indicates that the hair may have been laying around for a period of time, as opposed to recently shed.
And did you compare the hairs recovered from this Bronco cap to the known exemplars taken from the head of the defendant?
I did.
And what results did you obtain?
Well, these hairs exhibited the same microscopic characteristics and accordingly could have originated from the defendant.
So you found hairs consistent with those of the defendant in a cap found in his car. Was that a big surprise?
Well, if that's his hat, it's not a surprise to me.
Sustained.
All right. You also indicated that you found hairs on the blue knit cap found at the crime scene.
I did, yes.
People's 56I, Your Honor, previously marked. Tell us what you found on the in the evidence collected from the blue knit cap that's shown in the screen on the screen right now, People's 56I.
Well, from the knit hat, there were a number of hairs that were removed, either by Susan Brockbank, who was the original examiner on the case, or by me.
You personally removed some collected evidence from this cap yourself?
I did, yes. The hairs were removed from the inside and from the outside. Shall I specify? Or do you want it just a total number, or how would you like it?
Let's start with the total number and then we'll break it down. Okay.
There-
First
there-
of all, did you
yeah.
compare the hairs recovered from that cap to those of the defendant?
These particular hairs you're referring to, yes. I compared all of the hairs that were suitable for comparison from the hat with the known sample that was submitted from the defendant, yes.
And of the hairs recovered from the cap, you indicated already that you found hairs of the defendant that had the same microscopic characteristics. Can you tell us, first of all, how many overall head hairs did you find that exhibited the same microscopic characteristics in that cap as the defendant's hair?
Well, there were 12 hairs.
All right, can you describe for us some of the microscopic characteristics that you compared between the question hairs recovered from that blue knit cap to the defendant's hair?
I could read you some of my notes if that would make any sense. Okay, thanks.
I hope it will.
Okay, the known sample from the defendant consisted of numerous dark brown head hairs with roots. Most of the hairs were under 1 inch in length. The cuticle on the hair was medium thick. And again, some of these distinctions of medium, thin, and thick are just arbitrary based on how I saw them and how I perceived them. The inner definition of the cuticle was fair to poor, so sometimes you could see the definition, sometimes you couldn't. It was clear, there's no apparent color. The scale protrusion was slight. They exhibited blunt tips, had elongate pigment. The pigment granules were somewhat elongate. The clumping was not present in a lot of the hairs, and that's a characteristic, as I mentioned before, of black individuals.
You say clumping?
Clumping of the pigment, yes. Some black individuals have heavy clumping, others don't. And in some hairs within a sample, some may be more clumpier than others. So, the pigment granules were a medium size. The streaking was a very prominent characteristic. Streak in the sense that the pigment granules line themselves up in rows, and it appears that you have streaks within the cortex. Some of the hairs indicated a coarseness of the cellular material in the middle of the hair. Some of the hairs were patchy. Probably the most prominent characteristic of the hair sample, two being the color, being the lighter brown coloration, and one-sided pigmentation, which was a very prominent characteristic.
What do you mean by that? A very prominent characteristic?
Well, some hairs become distinctive as to how the pigment granules arrange themselves in the hair. In some individuals, and it may not depend necessarily on race, that the pigment granules will find themselves more to one side of the hair than the other, so that when you look at them microscopically, it just looks darker on one side of the hair. The ovoid bodies that were present were small and not very many. The cortical fusi were sparse, and most of them were located down near the proximal end or nearest to where the root is. And that in itself is not necessarily significant. The medulla was absent to trace, and I mentioned before the brownish, reddish-brown coloration in the known sample, and that's how I described them.
Okay. Now, those characteristics that you've just listed off to us, those were notes that you took as to the known standard recovered from the defendant's head by Susan Brockbank, correct?
That was my observations as I examined the known standard of hairs from the defendant under the microscope.
Did you see those same characteristics in the hairs that that were recovered from the blue knit ski cap, which you determined were consistent with those of the defendant?
Yes, I did. That's correct.
Now, those hairs that you determined were consistent with those of the defendant, were they naturally shed or forcibly removed?
Well, they were either naturally shed or they didn't have a root.
What does that mean?
Well, it just means that I mentioned before that black hairs often will break. They tend to be a little more brittle, and the cross-sectional shape is somewhat more flattened. It's not uncommon to see hair fragments from that racial group.
And when you said hair fragments, well, you also found hair fragments of Ron Goldman in the evidence, correct?
I did.
Okay. And were all of the hairs that were consistent with those of the defendant fragments, or were any full length?
No, there were a number of hairs that were full length. That is, they had a root, as if they were naturally shed hairs.
Now, did you also find hairs of black origin that did not match those, that were not consistent with those of the defendant?
I did.
And where were they found?
Again, I'd have to refer to my notes to be specific on that. And again, they would have been on the knit hat, either from the interior, and again, from the interior, I believe most of those were. The slides that were prepared by Susan Brockbank included our Q9 through Q19.
Mm-hmm.
Q9 through Q14 were from the interior of the hat, and there were apparently treated black head hairs found on several of the items, as well as other head hairs, other black head hairs that did not exhibit the same characteristics.
Now, the hairs that were found inside the cap that were not consistent with those of the defendant, were they full length or were they fragments?
No, they were fragments.
And how many of those fragments were there?
Could I refer to another set of notes? Thanks. There were 6.
Six? See, maybe I'm wrong, sir. I took notes from your notes, and I counted, based on your notes, I counted 7. Can you tell?
Sustain.
I'm
Excuse me, guys.
Thank you, Your Honor. Did you just count them, sir?
You could be right. I mean, I counted 6 in the first batch. I can recheck if you want, if it makes a difference, if there's 6 or 7.
All right, let's assume for now, well, maybe I can't do that. Go ahead and look. I was going to say assume there's 7, but go ahead and look, sir.